Hello everyone, how's it going? In this video, I wanted to go ahead and show you how to make this exact scene right in front of you. We are going to be using Blender and mainly focusing on improving the geometry and fixing it up, making it usable, as well as setting up nice materials, lighting, and a nice environment in no time at all. This is going to be specifically useful for architects or people that are going to be using geometry exported from SketchUp or Revit. This is useful, feel free to follow along. All of the necessary assets are linked down below. We are going to be using Sketchfab this time to get a nice base mesh, which comes with its own textures. Go ahead and download this and import it into Blender using whatever format you find best. They have three options that you can go ahead and try. First thing you want to do, select everything, press Alt-P to clear parent and keep transform. After doing that, you want to go to Objects, go to Relations, and make single user, object and data specifically. After doing that, what you want to do is select everything, press Ctrl G to merge it. I have already done that, which is why I'm not showing it right in front of you. After doing so, what you want to do is go to edit mode again and press P to separate by material. What this will do is create an object for each material. This is going to be helping you immensely in optimizing the scene, making the number of objects way smaller, thus making it easier to go ahead and improve later on. So the first step you want to go ahead is select the largest objects where the shading looks terrible. You want to try to press M merge by distance, and if that ruins the geometry more than fixing it, just keep it as is. And the most important factor is adding a weighted normal modifier. This is an extremely useful modifier, probably the most important normal fixing tool. And make sure to keep sharp for the most part. Make sure to shade auto smooth beforehand, otherwise it would not work and it will give you an error. Now after doing so, we want to go ahead and repeat this with every single object, specifically objects that will have a lot of, let's say, normals in terms of bump, or have glass and sharp reflections, such as glass, for instance. For example, glass, what you want to do is merge by distance, give it some thickness, as well as applying the weighted normal modifier. Now for the material of the laminated glass, what you want to do is add the principal BSDF, set the base color to somewhere around 0.25, so a darkish gray, set the roughness to 0, and the transmission to 1, extremely simple as well. Now for the actual metal, we are going to be using the same texture that came in with the actual file, especially if you have used the GLB file, it's going to come up with its own textures. It needs UVs, so in this case you want to go to edit mode, press on U, and cube projection. Go ahead to the UV editor and scale it up until it makes sense. Set the metallic one, set the roughness to anywhere from 0.3 to 0.6, depending on how shiny you want your metal to be. And I wanted to add some bevels, however adding that using the actual bevel modifier would ruin the geometry since it's quite terrible. So I am just adding a bevel modifier, and this is going to give us a similar-ish effect since we don't want to make any close-ups of the scene. No, this just saves up time and you don't really have to go ahead and remodel everything from scratch. And keep in mind, if you work with architects, this is the sort of quality you are going to be expecting. Now for the actual rocks or rock facade, M, merge by distance, and apply a material which comes already. Now for the material, we want a displacement map, which is literally the same exact map that came in with the file, but blurred using a blur node. Now for the blur node, you have to make it. Feel free to go ahead and take a screenshot of the setup, turn it into a group, or just leave it as is, and that should be good enough for you to add a blur node. Alternatively, you can go ahead and make it inside of Photoshop. make sure to invert the actual texture. So the darker colors are what goes in. And at that point, you are going to have something that's more or less similar to an actual spline map. Now make sure to add enough subdivision using the simple setup. And the more subdivision you have, the more details you are going to get. For the rest of the materials, I am going to be literally just using the same texture, plugging it into the normal slot with a color ramp as well as a bump node in between. Feel free to invert the actual colors in the color ramp or use an invert node. Now just get it to make actual sense. Keep in mind, 0 is what goes inwards, and 0, which is black, and white, which is a value of 1, is what goes upward. Lower the strength or the distance, what fit better. Ideally, you want to lower the distance, but sometimes a mix of both is okay. Now for the frosted glass, how are we going to make this? We are going to be adding an actual principled BSDF, keeping the albedo map to white, setting the transmission to 1, and setting the roughness to 0.3. Experiment with this until you get something that you actually like, and make sure to experiment using cycles. Add a noise texture, plug it into the normal, add a color ramp as well as a bump map. Make the scale very large, just to resemble how actually frosted glass looks like. It has some microdents inside of it, which refracts the light and make it look like it's frosted, so not perfectly see-through. Make sure that the strength is way low, as well as the distance, and also make sure that the scale is smaller than larger. Now you can go ahead and play with the color. You can add actual maps inside of the normal map, but we are seeing this from far away, and it's not going to be a close-up. The main focus of this video is just showing you how to deal with, let's say, with all respect, extremely bad geometry for the most part. No, and this is just the nature of it, especially if you go ahead and turn actual nerves or turn not typical geometry or traditional geometry that we go ahead and use inside of Blender or Maya or 3ds Max or Cinema 4D, but something out of Revit. Revit usually is fine, or something out of SketchUp, or something out of ArchiCAD, which is what most architects are going to be using. As you can see, I added a simple plane. I also added a camera, which I'm going to be positioning it. Go ahead and give the camera focal length of 28 just to have some nice distortions. And what I want to do is give it a height of 1.5. Now, if you have the actual navigation with gravity setup, you can go ahead and set it up to have a specific, let's say, eye view height, which is what I'm doing here. Pressing Shift F, which is what I have set up the actual shortcut to be for walking navigation. Now for the texture of the actual mesh here, I'm going to be using something out of Quixel Bridge. You can use whatever texture you have access to. You can even keep it as a base color. I recommend that you add a nice texture regardless. However, we are going to be populating this with some really, really nice assets as well. As you can see, the regular PBR workflow. Now make sure to set the normals somewhere that makes actual sense. Now, if we scale it up by 100 meters, most of these textures from Bridge are 2 meters by 2 meters. So we want to scale it up the same way. So if we scaled up the actual plane 100 times, we want to scale up the UVs also 100 times, since the base plane is 2 meters and the base texture is 2 meters as well. As you could see, I played with Push Elliptic to give it a nice sort of hill look, added a subdivision surface, and also added some slight displacement using the clouds texture. Some really basic things, but will add a lot when it comes to adding some nice vegetation on top, as well as improving the quality of the shadows. Now, we want to go ahead and apply the scale, open a certain biome, but before doing that, what you want to do, go to edit mode, scale it to 0.1, just to avoid crashes. Go ahead and apply the biome again. I am using the 15th anniversary of Evermotion. The biome was absolutely free, but now it costs $5, extremely cheap. Now, after doing that and importing everything, I would like you to hide all of this just to avoid crashes, since the actual biome is extremely heavy and on 200 meters plane, it's going to definitely crash. So I scale it up on 0.1. And how do I get it to where it was? I will go to edit mode and scale it up by a factor of 10. And it's going to be on the same exact area. After that, what you want to do is go ahead and enable display as, improve optimization, add the visibility, make sure to add camera clipping, and add a bit in the FOV boost. Do this for everything other than the trees. Why? Because we want to have some trees behind the camera and anywhere where the camera can see. For the simple fact that we need the actual shadows and reflections that will come from our beautiful trees. Probably my favorite biomes until now. And ironically the cheapest out of all of them. And go ahead and do the same exact thing. Enable the display as in the actual viewport. And as you could see, I just scaled it up by a factor of 10. So now it makes sense, as you could see, extremely optimized and did not crash at all. Now I don't want the trees to be peeking out of the house, so I'm going to be painting an actual weight map and removing it from in front of the camera, the tree specifically. And I don't want anything to be peeking from the actual house. Go to color masks in the trees. Go ahead and add the vertex group and it should work correctly. Now make sure to go back and forth. Just make sure that you don't have any trees obscuring the camera if that's what you want. If you want a tree in front of the camera to give you a nice effect or maybe an artistic sort of render, in this case I do not want that. But feel free to experiment. Go ahead, do that also for the small trees and whatever large nature element that you don't want to obscure the actual camera. Now for the lighting, I'm using the very faithful sky texture. Extremely beautiful, extremely useful. And honestly, I rarely use HDRIs for daylight lighting, other than direct visibility override. Set the ozone layer to 4, set the altitude to 4000, and set the sun elevation to somewhere around 3 p.m., 4 p.m., which is what I want, so around 29 degrees. After that, you want to go ahead and visualize everything and play with the sun rotation until you got a very nice shadow profile as well, which we are going to be improving later on and not actually relying on the actual biome reader or the actual scattering. As you can see, it already looks quite interesting, but I want to go ahead and play with the actual sun rotation as well and come back to the vertex paint just to go ahead and hide this specific tree that I don't like, but it seems to not work, which is why I'm going to choose everything, go to distribution, and go ahead and play with the actual seed until I get something that I actually like. Now you can go ahead back and forth between this as well as the weight map until you get something that you like. This might take a bit of time. The more time you play with it, the better it's going to look. But just for the sake of keeping this video shorter, I'm going to go a bit sloppily now. Go ahead and play with the actual rotation until you get something that you like. Honestly, I like a couple of these setups, but I'm going to choose one. As you could see, I forgot to actually apply a material for the aluminum sleds on top, the roof, which is why I'm going to go ahead and add it in as well. Use the same corrugated metal that I have added. Now again, if you want to merge all objects, you want to press Shift L, select select linked by materials, and choose whatever objects you want to merge. Go ahead and do that. Press Ctrl G afterward. And after doing that, you want to add a weighted normal modifier. By the way, for these tutorials, I stopped actually planning beforehand, just so I can show you these common issues that you are going to be facing and show you how to fix all of them. So this is completely improvised and not scripted beforehand. Now it looks more or less correct. At this point, I want to add some nicer shadows, targeted specifically towards the house. So I'm using whatever tree I have, which isn't too full, but isn't too empty at the same time. I want some nice leaves, and I want the actual shadow to be casted on top of the actual trees that you already have from the Evermotion biome. At this point, Blender is getting quite heavy, which is why I am going to actually start working without seeing the biomes that we have added, so without seeing any trees, just so the scene is much more responsive. I want to add some slight fog, not too heavy, because I don't see much of the horizon either way, but add a cube, add to it a principled volume, and play with it. I don't want it to interfere too much with the sky color, and with the trees, I don't want a foggy, let's say, setup, but I want some slight saturation on the back part of the actual scene, so in the background. Now, I want a bluer tint in the sky, but I don't want the shadows to be bluer, which is why I'm doing the same useful trick that I do in almost all of the previous videos, which is duplicate the sky texture, up its saturation, and go ahead with a mix shader and mix it with our actual intended lighting setup with our direct override visibility map. Mix it with a light path node with the S-camera array slot into the mix slot, and this should give you a nice setup. Now at this point, we have a lot of the scene completely done, and at this point you have to make a decision whether this is good enough for you, whether the deadline has been reached, and if you have some spare time, I would highly recommend that you go ahead and spend some more time adding hand-placed objects, as well as polishing everything. Maybe you don't like the lighting, improve the lighting, try different rotations, try different times of the day, play with a different biome if you want. Completely up to you. Play with the shadows, add some scans, add some people if you want. I'm going to be talking about that in a video later on. And I like to use AGX in the color management. Sometimes film makes color look more intended, right? But I don't like them. Honestly, AGX, the best color management that the Blender currently has. ACES is great, but I find AGX to be easier to use, and you don't have to make the actual maps or textures coherent. So AGX does all of this for you. As you can see, you are keeping it with AGX, keeping the look to none. And I recommend that you do the contrast inside of Photoshop or Lightroom or any other software which is more targeted towards color correction. You can go ahead and add some depth of field, choose the house, and make sure to not have a large f-stop, otherwise your scene would look more like a miniature scene. Something more realistic, 8 or 16, you want to have some very slight actual depth of field and blurring, or anything that's close or way too far off. You know, this isn't a close-up shot. This is a shot of an entire cabin. Too much depth of field, too much blurring will make the house look like a miniature and will make the scene look very, very odd and weird. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and use an add-on, which is called Photographer 5, to add some slight bloom or glare at the same time. Streaks, so glare. You can do this with the actual, let's say, compositor inside of Blender, but this add-on makes this into a very neat slider setup instead of the actual node setup. Very nice, very beautiful setup, extremely neat, and quite fun to use. You want to up the white balance, you don't have to do this. You can do it inside of Photoshop, you can do it inside of the compositor, Lightroom, whatever software you feel more comfortable in. After doing so, you have to set up your actual settings to run the final render. As always, we are using cycles with the GPU compute if you have access to a nice GPU as well. After doing that, let's go ahead and go to the actual sampling. Set the render samples to something like 800. Disable noise threshold. I do not like to work with it for the most part. And set up the resolution to whatever resolution you want. So this is going to be the end of our video. If you found it useful, feel free to subscribe, check our Instagram, our Discord if you have any questions. Until next time, take care and enjoy yourself. Out.